Wonderful. So the final section in 11.4 focuses on traits that do follow the Mendelian inheritance patterns. But when we are looking at inheritance patterns, one thing that is for sure is that humans are not great subjects for genetic research because, as you know, Mendel liked the pea plants because he could choose exactly who bred with who, and they bred relatively quickly, so he could observe the results of those breedings. But humans, you can't really force them to marry certain people and breed with them to observe the results. And it takes way too long to have children, and you can only usually have a few children in your lifetime. So they're not great to follow genetic patterns of inheritance, but we use his pea plant experiments to help us understand what goes on with humans. Since we can't use humans, we tend to look at human genetics retroactively. So we do this by looking at something known as a pedigree. And this is really a family tree that shows us the relationships between parents and children over several generations. And then we use the pedigree to help us determine inheritance patterns of a particular trait. Um, Once we've established the inheritance patterns that exist within a family, we can use pedigrees to make predictions about future offspring, especially knowing the multiplication and addition probability rules. So typically when you see a pedigree, the square will represent a male while the circle will represent a female. If the square or circle is colored in, we know that they have the trait that we're looking at. And if they're attached by a line horizontally, that means that they mated. And if they're attached by vertical lines, that means they are the offspring. And we typically write the offspring in birth order, with the firstborn being on the left. So these pedigrees show two examples, one for the widow's peak trait and one for the ability to taste PTC, which is kind of a bitter taste. So the widow's peak, we first took a look at the grandparents, and we saw that one of the grandparents, the grandfather, had the widow's peak while the grandmother did not. And then we observed that out of their parents, their children, they had one with widow's peak, two without, and then another one with who was a male. And then this set of grandparents, we had a male without and a female with a widow's peak, and they had a female with a widow's peak and a male without. And of these two groups, the father who had a widow's peak married a mother who had a widow's peak, and they had two daughters, one with the widow's peak and one without. So you can see she has a widow's peak right here. This daughter does not have it. So in this case, we're able to take a look at how the parents mated, and because these parents both had widow's peaks, but they were able to produce a daughter without one, we know that that's a dominant trait. If you take a look at this pedigree over on this right side, this pedigree is testing the inability to taste PTC. So the inability to taste PTC is the trait being examined. So if you see it colored in, that means they're not able to taste it. And hopefully you're able to now follow this pedigree and read it. This is the widow's peak pedigree a little bit closer. And this is the inability to taste PTC pedigree a little bit closer. So now we're going to talk about recessively inherited disorders. So most genetic disorders are inherited by the recessive gene, and these could be mild to very life-threatening. So heterozygotes that have the recessive allele are known as carriers because when we have recessively inherited disorders, they only show up in individuals who are homozygous for the allele. However, that recessive allele can be passed on in the heterozygote, and that's why they're referred to as carriers, because they carry that allele, but phenotypically they look and appear normal. Many people who have recessive disorders are born to parents who are carriers because, especially before we were able to test for these things ahead of time, the two parents would be unaffected, but they would be carriers and have an affected child. So this is an example. Albinism is one recessive disorder, and if you have the recessive gene, you have both copies of the recessive allele, you will express the albino phenotype. However, two normal parents still have a 1/4 chance of producing a child who is albino. Now, this is a pretty mild disorder. Most of the time, individuals who are albino can live a relatively normal life. They just need a little bit more sunscreen. However, if the recessive allele that causes a disease is rare, then the chance of two carriers meeting and mating is low. However, in the past, the reason why many marriages between close relatives were banned was because even though we didn't know about genetics, we observed that there was a lot of genetic disorders that came to the offspring of people who got married who were closely related. And that's because people who are closely related are most likely more likely to be carriers, and then they would produce an offspring who carried that recessive trait. Cystic fibrosis is a much more dangerous disease. It is actually the most common lethal genetic disease in the United States, and it is the result of a defective or absent chloride transport channel in the plasma membrane. And essentially what happens is without this ion channel, some mucus builds up in the internal organs, and the small intestine is not able to absorb nutrients. This is a recessively inherited disorder, so you have to have both copies of the recessive allele to express cystic fibrosis. This is a much more dangerous disorder, so you can see where it is important for parents to know whether they're carriers, because that might help eliminate the chance of them mating with somebody who was also a carrier. Sickle cell disease is another genetic disorder which has an evolutionary implication as well. So this disease is particularly prevalent among African Americans due to the actions of natural selection. What the disease is essentially there's a substitution of a single amino acid in the hemoglobin protein in red blood cells, which causes there to be lower levels of oxygen. And when there's low levels of oxygen, the phenotypic result is that the hemoglobin is abnormal and causes their red blood cells to be sickle-shaped. So with homozygous recessive individuals, all the hemoglobin is sickle cell shaped, and these sickle cells can clog and cramp your blood cells, resulting in physical weakness, pain, organ damage, and even strokes. So it was observed, however, that heterozygotes who have the sickle cell trait as carriers, they are healthy, but they might suffer some symptoms because some of their cells will be sickle cell shaped and some will be normal. And about 1 out of 10 African Americans usually has the sickle cell trait, which is pretty high considering the fact that there are life-threatening implications if you're homozygous recessive for this trait. But what scientists have found is that these heterozygotes are less susceptible to the malaria parasite. So in areas of Africa where malaria is quite common, there is actually an advantage to being heterozygous, because the heterozygotes the homozygotes, the recessive ones, may pass on from sickle cell disease, but the heterozygotes are protected from death from malaria. So they tend to actually sometimes survive even better than homozygous dominants who have normal red blood cells. So that's why evolutionary biologists believe that this trait has survived despite the fact that its recessive homozygous alleles are pretty detrimental. And this is what the sickle cell actually looks like. However, there are also dominantly inherited disorders. So we've been talking about inherited disorders that are caused by the 2 copies of the recessive allele, but some disorders are inherited by dominant alleles. Dominant alleles that cause a lethal disease are very rare and typically result from mutations because they have been mostly eradicated by evolution. But those that are not life-threatening can arise anyway. So one example is achondroplasia, which is a form of dwarfism. And you can see if you have the dwarf phenotype, like a dwarf parent and a normal parent, you would have a 50-50 chance of having a child who was also a dwarf. Because with that dominant allele, the dwarf phenotype is expressed. So even if you're a heterozygote, you would express the dwarf phenotype. However, there is also the implications of timing on a disease. So Huntington's disease is a very sad and serious degenerative disease of the brain and the nervous system. Those who are affected by Huntington's disease have no major phenotypic effects until about 35 to 45 years old. And once they reach this age, that's when the disease really starts to take effect, and the nervous system begins a irreversible kind of degeneration, and eventually the individual will die. This is a dominantly inherited disorder, so unfortunately, the child of a parent with Huntington's disease has about a 50% chance of inheriting the allele as well. But because the symptoms don't arise until about 35 to 45 years of age, those who have the Huntington's disease allele are able to produce offspring before dying. So this gene has continued to be passed on and hasn't been eradicated yet. And we'll talk about some of the serious implications of that in a moment. It's important to note that many diseases, such as heart disease, diabetes, alcoholism, mental illness, and cancer, do have a genetic component, but they are also the result of environmental components. So we talked a little bit about this in 11.3, but your lifestyle has a huge effect on the phenotypes that you will express, especially when it comes to cardiovascular health and other multifactorial characters like cancer. The way that you live your life now impacts the way that your genes will express themselves. And we don't fully understand this yet, but we do know that many disorders are not only genetic, they also have an environmental component. So genetic counseling is a field that has really grown in the last several years because we know so much more about genetics now. And genetic counselors are able to provide information to prospective parents concerned about the family history for a particular disease. Since each child represents an independent event, meaning that their genotype is no way affected by the genotypes of the older siblings, every time you have a new zygote, remember that it's random fertilization. Any sperm can be with any egg, and those chromosomes to create those have independently assorted and have separated independently. So just because you have a child with the disease doesn't mean if you have another child, they won't also have a disease. And so genetic counseling is kind of really grown in traction, but it can also be something very serious to think about, especially when it comes to a disorder such as Huntington's disease. It makes it difficult because if you are tested for that gene, you will express the phenotype with your nervous system degenerating and eventually causing death at a pretty young age. However, it's kind of stressful because families where this runs in the family do know that if they have the gene, they will express it because it's a dominant phenotype. So the question becomes, should I get tested for Huntington's if it runs in my family? Because you could be in high school and know that you are going to contract this disease by the time you're age 50. And a lot of people don't really know what to do with that information. There's still hope because we might find a cure, but genetic counseling is definitely an area that has seen a lot of growth and might be a field that you're interested in, and being able to make those decisions and help people through them. So that gives you a little bit more information about the way that we use inheritance patterns to make decisions.